The following program was made possible by the financial support of viewers like you.
Good morning, everybody, although it's not a good morning for the United Nations Army in Korea or the cause of democracy throughout the world. General MacArthur has announced a brand new war against 200,000 Chinese communist troops who right now are rolling back American, British, Turkish, and South Korean forces in the most serious UN retreat of the war. These developments have come with stunning suddenness in the past few hours, resulting in a communique from MacArthur's headquarters, which is perhaps the gravest document of its kind since World War II. It makes news so serious that all other developments this morning, storms, domestic politics, seem minor indeed by comparison.
In the savage early winter of 1950, United Nations forces in North Korea were reeling from an overwhelming Chinese and North Korean attack. Their retreat was to change the fate of the Korean people and shake the confidence of the West.
Having dealt with a very difficult war, we all were of a mind that it was over. And when we had a sense now that maybe it had only begun and that we had to start back from where we were, of all the things that happened in the Korean War, I would have to say that may have been the thing that stood me on end more than anything else.
Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China, in existence for only a year, had come to the aid of North Korea, as theatrically reconstructed here. The Chinese slogan was, "Resist America, Aid Korea." It was a battle both to defend their border and to help old comrades in arms, the Korean communists.
为了把美国人赶出朝鲜去，不需要
We were fighting to drive the Americans out of Korea, to stop their intervention in the affairs of Asia. This great goal inspired us with heroism and self-sacrifice, and we would look death unflinchingly in the face when we threw ourselves into battle. Our common greeting in Korea when we met, especially among old comrades, was not, "How are you?" but "Have you died yet?"
How are you? 你说他什么呢？说你 Have you died yet?
In the autumn of 1950, 100,000 UN and South Korean troops split forces to occupy North Korea. By late October, advance elements had reached the Chinese border. Facing what they perceived as a threat to their security, the Chinese crossed the Yalu River and attacked the two UN armies divided by mountains. The Chinese had joined forces with the regrouped North Korean army and tens of thousands of guerrillas. General MacArthur, commanding UN forces from Tokyo, had discounted indications of this buildup. The attack, when it came, was a stunning blow that threw the UN forces into headlong retreat.
At the White House in Washington, top defense officials of the nation gathered to discuss the gravest world crisis since Poland and Pearl Harbor. The flagrant aggression of Chinese communist troops in Korea arouses the country's ire. With the North Korean bandits well under control and with the promise that UN troops would be withdrawn, the unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III.
We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
The crisis deepened when Truman revealed that the use of the atom bomb was being considered. He implied the decision was up to MacArthur. Concerned White House staffers called Paul Nitze at state.
I was told that the president, Mr. Truman, had just said that he would rely upon a recommendation from General MacArthur as to whether or not to use nuclear weapons in Korea. And that was totally contrary to policy. And they asked me what should be done about it. And I said, well, I would suggest that that section of the record of the press conference be ciced. And they said, we agree with you. And I suggested some other language which would be substituted.
Consideration of the use of any weapon is always implicit in the very possession of that weapon. However, it should be emphasized that by law, only the president can authorize the use of the atom bomb, and no such authorization has been given.
So that's the way the record was changed. But all the press had been there, and they'd all heard what the president actually had said. So that by the time the press conference was over, we got word that Mr. Attlee was going to take the plane and was on his way to Washington.
America's allies were alarmed, and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee hurried to Washington.
My aim in these talks is to align our policies in the new and troubled situation in the world and to find the means of upholding what we both know to be right.
In their talks, Attlee told Truman extending the war to China would lose America the support of her allies. Truman agreed to consult him if atomic bombs were to be used. But a key advisor says Truman never seriously considered their use.
I have never seen any evidence, and I was present with President Truman in most of these meetings. I've never seen any indication that he was prepared to turn this into a nuclear war of any sort. Among other things, we had only a limited number of nuclear weapons. The A-bomb we dropped on Nagasaki was the only one we had in stock at that moment. And I think President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to keep such a small inventory as we had in reserve in case there were major problems with the Soviet Union, say, in Europe. So he had no inclination to go down the nuclear trail in this situation.
High in the mountains of North Korea, the UN forces were in deep trouble, surrounded by Chinese. Army troops of the U.S. 7th Division and 15,000 U.S. Marines were cut off at the Changjin Reservoir, a place they knew as Chosin. Frozen Chosin.
The first inclination that one gets is when you're surrounded, well, you're going to be attacked from all directions, and the Chinese didn't disappoint us. They hit us at night, they hit us in the day, and they hit us in every direction that they could possibly do it. The numbers that they had were tremendous. That's when they had their charges, and manpower to them was unimportant. They didn't care how many men that they lost or anything. They just sent them against our lines until they were either killed, wounded, or there just weren't enough of them to continue the attack.
When I was in the Chinese army, the communists told us that the Americans could not fight. They were soft, wealthy boy soldiers, and when they marched, they needed quilts on the ground. We outnumbered them 10 to 1. The American bullets were not as numerous as our Chinese men.
To beleaguered Americans, the Chinese seemed superhuman, but captured prisoners revealed appalling hardship. Unable to light fires because of air attack, they slept out in temperatures that fell far below zero.
When we reached North Korea, it was much, much colder than mainland China. A lot of people I knew lost their hands, some lost their ears, and even their feet because of the cold.
The Marines also froze. Exhausted by constant night attacks, soldiers simply slept in the snow. Frostbite claimed more victims than the fighting. Isolated in small defensive pockets, the Marines were pinned down by Chinese troops and North Korean guerrillas. But they discovered a higher toll among Army units located to the east of the reservoir.
Went on to the ice, and I remember coming upon some of the fellows from the 7th Division. They were lying on the ice, and the warmth of their body had melted in their clothing into the ice, and we had to use our bayonets to chip and chop the ice out underneath them so that we could drag them and bring them back into the American lines. Well,
in 33 years in Asia and having attended or participated in 4 wars, I can't recall anything as serious as this experience was. And there were times when I felt more like a Marine than I did a correspondent. All of my instincts wanted me to get out of there, or told me to get the hell out of there, fly out.
At Hagaru-ri, the Marines blasted out an emergency airstrip. The most seriously wounded were airlifted to South Korea and Japan. The Air Force offered to evacuate all personnel, but this would have meant abandoning equipment, and the Marines decided to fight their way out overland. Whatever couldn't be taken was destroyed. Nothing was left to help the enemy.
Hagaru-ri, we were attacked successively by 2 Chinese divisions, which meant that we were outnumbered perhaps 15 to 1. We had numbers of advantages, though. First, our supporting arms were much better than the Chinese. Second, our communications were much better. Third, although we were cold and miserable, we were less cold and miserable than the Chinese. Fourth, we had aviation and lots of it.
Air power was a decisive factor. American planes ranged virtually unchallenged over North Korea, bombing and strafing at will. The air cover, along with help from the Army's 7th and 3rd Divisions, enabled the Marines to break out. They escaped south toward the coast in an orderly retreat. The discipline of the Marine officers made an impression on their troops.
They were inspirational. You never wondered where your CO was. You never wondered where other leadership was. It was there. They were confident. They did not panic.
By mid-December, the relieved survivors had reached the relative safety of the coast. Of 15,000 Marines, some 3,000 were dead and 7,000 wounded. But their ordeal was over. Meanwhile, across the mountains in the west, shaken UN forces beat a hasty retreat in what became known as bug-out fever. Some units panicked, but all hurried south as fast as their vehicles could carry them, faster than the Chinese and North Korean forces could pursue.
There was no doubt that the general view of the people in the Argylls who knew about strategy, etc., was that the whole army was retreating unnecessarily fast. And they felt, and this was just their opinion, that when the main bulk of the American army had come in, they'd all gone absolutely gung-ho for the north, and you couldn't see them for dust. They swept past the battalion, waving cheerfully, and wondering why the poor old Argylls were plodding along with their pipers as they went past. And after a few weeks, I think it was, the same Argyles were still plodding northwards when the whole caravan came from the north, going equally fast to the south, and passed by as if all the devils in hell were behind them.
On December the 5th, the U.S. Eighth Army abandoned Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, to the Communists. The city was largely destroyed, the result of bombing and systematic demolition by retreating UN forces. Their 7-week occupation was over, the only occasion a communist capital has ever been held by the West. North Korean newsreel film shows the returning People's Army receiving a warm welcome from the population. But not everyone chose to remain under the rule of Kim Il-sung. Many residents left with the retreating UN army and have been separated from their families to this day.
One morning we found out that they all retreated to the other side of the river, which flows in the middle of the Pyongyang city. So we started coming out, and lots of people crossed the river with some kind of a boat made with empty drums, and they came down to South Korea.
Thousands fled Pyongyang, some crawling across shattered bridges in freezing temperatures. Refugees with no homes, no animals, and little food. Some say they simply feared for their survival, others that they left to escape communism.
My sense is that this was, in fact, an act of voting by peace. The Communist Party in North Korea had made a great number of mistakes. In some ways, they were very radical in instituting reforms of communist variety. They had persecuted Christianity and other forms of religion. And people simply did not find the Communist Party to their liking. And they, therefore, fled the scene.
It could hardly be said that the South, under the government of Syngman Rhee, was a haven of democracy and civil rights. As the UN fell back, anti-communist vigilantes and the Korean National Police rounded up anyone suspected of holding left-wing sympathies. Political prisoners, forced to wear traditional straw masks identifying them as criminals, were marched off to detention. Western correspondents reported how many were beaten, tortured, and sometimes executed. In North Korea today, in Sinchon County near the border, there is a memorial to atrocities against civilians. North Korea claims that here, as UN forces pulled out in early December 1950, 102 small children were incarcerated in an unused ammunition store. They were separated from their mothers, who refused to reveal the whereabouts of men from the village. The memorial says 2 children survived. One is Kim Young-ja.
After a while, I heard a lot of talking outside. Then some black objects flew in through the ventilation hole and started to explode with loud bangs. They were hand grenades. The children who were sitting on the floor, pleading for their mothers and for water, disappeared altogether. And on the floor, their heads, arms, legs, and torsos were rolling about. The walls were splattered with children's flesh and blood.
North Korea provides this wartime film of Sinchon and its evidence of the massacre of children there. A few Western historians have heard of the event, but can add no details. It is not clear who controlled the area at the time. But North Korea's witness has no doubt who was responsible.
My heart hurts so much whenever I come here. I lost my mother and my father through the Americans. I can never forget. And I renew my resolution to get revenge on the Americans, 100 and 1,000-fold.
The murder of innocent civilians by both sides was a tragic theme that recurred throughout the Korean War.
The North Koreans committed very serious atrocities in the South when they left. And they committed atrocities again when their rule was reimposed or when their officials came back to their native territories. And the atrocities were mainly imposed on people thought to be collaborators with the regime. Many of them were killed or put on trial. We know this because Kim Il-sung and the high leadership had to intervene to stop it because it was getting out of hand. One can imagine in a civil war these things happening. It happened in the American Civil War time and time again. But of course, in the West, we tend to think that it was the North Koreans who were the most atrocious and the South Koreans who were bad and the Americans didn't do anything. But in fact, all three parties committed unforgivable atrocities.
At the depth of the retreat, just as UN forces withdrew over the 38th parallel back into South Korea, the commander of the 8th Army, General Walton Walker, was killed in a collision with a South Korean.
He skidded at a bend on an icy road. He'd overturned off the road and he was killed instantly. I was following with some colleagues, BBC colleagues, Lenny Cutler and Phil Page, and we jumped out, attempted at first to see whether we could give assistance, but that was not possible.
Walker was held responsible by some for the hasty retreat, but his death was a severe blow to the Americans and underlined the deep despondency on the UN side. On Christmas Eve on the eastern coast, the last UN forces were evacuated from the North Korean port of Hungnam. U.S. military engineers prepared to demolish the city. The departure of U.S. forces from the north concluded an episode which Secretary of State Dean Acheson described as the United States' worst military defeat for a century. But at Hungnam, the communists inherited a wasteland. The fortune of UN forces, however, was about to improve. The new commander in Korea was General Matthew Ridgway, a tough paratrooper and D-Day veteran. He left his family at Christmas and flew immediately to the front. Ridgway was to prove a remarkable commander, methodical, combative, and inspirational. His personal pilot was Mike Lynch.
Ridgway was probably the bravest man I've ever met. On one occasion, as an example, we took a town by ourselves. We flew in, landed in the middle of the town, got out, and then met the 1st Cavalry Division as it was coming down the road.
Ridgway wanted to show that he was a fighting soldier, ready to meet the enemy man to man if necessary.
General Ridgway, he used to walk around with 2 grenades put into his top pocket. They called him Tin Tits, and there wasn't going to be no bug out for him. He was going north.
Ridgway faced an enormous challenge to restore confidence and fighting spirit in his defeated army. Morale among retreating South Korean and American soldiers had reached a low ebb. On New Year's Eve, the Communists launched a massive fresh offensive. The UN had already fallen back 200 miles. Now it retreated 70 miles further south to the 37th parallel. Seoul fell to the Communists on the 4th of January, the third time the South Korean capital had changed hands in the war. Like Pyongyang, Seoul was badly damaged, its population reduced to a tenth its peacetime level. North Korean troops occupied the center of the city. UN forces resisted, only to cover their withdrawal south.
A common-sense military strategy to fight us in order to recapture Seoul would have been for them to move south of the Han River to set up their defense line there. But instead, the enemy simply retreated in one go to the Suwon line 20 miles further south. This indicates the intensity of our pursuit and the enemy's lack of strength to defend from the bank of the Han River.
It was less than 4 months since MacArthur had staged his triumphant landing at Incheon. Now the fort was evacuated without fanfare and torch.
The next morning, we joined the retreating forces going south, and it was one of the most depressing days of my life. I had been in World War II, and I was used to victorious American troops. Here was a defeated army coming south. 2 lines of jeep, truck, tanks moving rapidly down the road. But besides that, what sticks in my mind is the South Koreans who were also fleeing south. There was no room for them on the road, so they walked along the side of the road. Old men, babies, children, mothers, carrying what they had on their back, bitterly cold, below zero. And the sound, when the vehicles would stop, it was actually a moan, a human sound of dejection, suffering coming from that single line that was going south.
I remember being on the south bank of the Han River. It was a very cold day, and asking the general, who was a good general and good friend, I said, well, where do we go from here? And he wrote with his finger in the dust on the gate, "Get the hell out of Korea," and rubbed it off. And that's the way an awful lot of it. That's the way an awful lot of it felt. Because we had victory within our grasp, and the Chinese entry into the war.
By late January, Ridgway had seen enough to act. He made a number of determined moves to restore morale and combat effectiveness. In a marked departure from past tactics, troops were ordered off the roads and into the hills. Ridgway fired many top officers and instituted a policy of sharp, aggressive patrolling to reestablish contact with the enemy. One of the first units given a chance to counterattack was the Turkish Brigade, badly mauled by the Chinese 2 months earlier. The Turks were tough soldiers and keen to take the offensive.
All the men fix their bayonets, and with their rifles under their arms, they shout, "Allah, Allah." This raises morale, saying the name of God, Allah. In this manner, they run 35 meters toward the enemy positions.
The Turks were renowned among the other UN forces for their fearsome bayonets, which they employed to lethal effect in hand-to-hand combat.
The design of the Turkish bayonet is very important. It is both thick and durable. The grooves on both sides of the bayonet are deep. As a result, an air pocket is created, and the bayonet can be pulled out easily. The American bayonets, on the other hand, are made very thin and have shallow grooves. Therefore, when the bayonet enters the human body, the flesh clamps tight around it. It is impossible to pull it out unless one fires a live bullet.
Another part of Ridgway's strategy was relentless use of artillery to keep the communists pinned down. His philosophy became known as the meat grinder, exploiting the UN's superior equipment to inflict maximum casualties on the other side.
What endeared General Ridgway to us was his immediate recognition of the problem. This great weight of Chinese forces against us that could advance and knock us out of the way, but did not have very good directional and staying power once they'd started an attack. And so he went round personally saying to people, now boys, we are going to roll with the punches. I'm not going to expend a lot of lives on holding a particular piece of Korean real estate. This was music to our ears. This was exactly the right tactic. You rolled with a punch. You took the Chinese weight of attack on, let it diminish in weight, and then you counterattack with your superior mobility on the ground and weight of weapons in the air.
An American pilot, decorated for his service later, recalls the air war.
We had 500-pound bombs. You carry those. We carried some 1,000-pound bombs. We carried high-velocity aircraft rockets, 5-inch rockets. We did a lot of napalm work where you carried droppable fuel tanks loaded with napalm. You came in on what we called a nape scrape, which is where you came in so low you were almost flying into the targets that you were going to put napalm on. You could strafe targets on the ground, you could bomb them, you could napalm them, you could rocket them. And there's quite a variety of weapons we could bring to bear on either frontline positions of the enemy or on support structures back, such as bridges or trucks or supply columns.
Napalm, jellied fuel, was a favored and effective Air Force weapon. More than 40 million gallons were dropped in the Korean War. Those who survived cannot forget its effects.
The Americans frequently attacked a bridge in my village. One day, I was among a group of 30 peasants reconstructing this bridge. Suddenly, an aircraft appeared and dropped napalm bombs on us. Many houses were burned, and the peasants on the reconstruction were all killed by the flames. I was the only survivor. When I opened my eyes, my whole body was on fire.
But to UN troops facing masses of charging Chinese, napalm was often a lifesaver.
It is one of those things which, in time of peace, people are apt to wring their hands over and agonize over, but I can tell you right now that if you've got 2,000 people coming up a hill at you, the spine of a hill at you, and their aim is to kill you, destroy you, you are only too ready, and I was certainly only too ready, to call down napalm onto columns of that sort to knock them out. The adrenaline is flowing in one's veins. It is a question of self-survival.
American firepower made an impressive spectacle, here laid on for John Ford directing a Hollywood morale booster.
For John Ford's purposes, we were allowed to burn the village. And so we did. We made an attack against the village. So it was empty, of course, didn't hurt anybody. But we did a full-fledged assault with all the things that we would do using flamethrowers and mortar shells and machine guns and all the rest of it. And this is some of the most stirring footage in that film, is this full-flaming assault of the village, which was done purely for John Ford.
This action was staged, but it was little different from what took place on a daily basis in villages throughout Korea. Often the victims were bystanders, helplessly caught up in the conflict.
I often thought to myself that the North Koreans were like ghosts. They passed over the countryside and left no mark on it in many ways. But when you use the rock crusher techniques of the American Army, you hurt your friends. That was true in Vietnam as well as in Korea.
North Korean tactics relied less on massive firepower. They did include guerrilla units, which blurred the distinction between military and civilian. A future British defense minister remembers his unease at the consequences.
The thing that perhaps shook me more than anything was to see people in extreme danger, certainly, just shooting other people indiscriminately, and even shooting civilians. Now, it wasn't to blame people for doing that, because it was a perfectly well-known ploy of the enemy to dress as civilians and then to turn and shoot you. But I must say, going to a village and seeing soldiers shooting people that they hadn't proved were enemies, although I accept it was necessary, and I wouldn't have dreamt of saying otherwise, was a horrible expression of how unacceptable war is. And that's something that people who watch war on television should bear in mind.
By early March, UN forces were back at the Han River just south of Seoul. The tide of war had turned once again, and now it was the communists who relinquished their game. Under round-the-clock bombardment, Chinese logistics were stretched to the limit, and Peng Dehuai, their commander, returned home to inform Mao Zedong that outright victory was not a realistic hope. On March 14th, the UN recaptured Seoul. It was the final occasion the capital changed hands. The city was physically and economically shattered. The starving population was reduced to lining up for relief supplies of rice. The military situation improved for the UN, but General MacArthur was increasingly disaffected with Washington's policy of containment, which Ridgway was so effectively implementing. MacArthur still wanted to widen the war to China, as he confided one day to an astonished French journalist.
Very simple. This was simple. And we all know it. It's 5 atom bombs. You drop them on the top of the 5 main Chinese cities. And if you do that, the Russians will know that this is in business, and they will do it in Russia too. And that will end the war. But nobody will end that war if we don't do something like that. I was trembling with, not so much, of course, there were very, very wide statements at the time. But what made me tremble was not the statements in themselves, but the fact that they were just to me in such a casual way that I was meeting with General Wilson to give me only 10 minutes, then he kept me an hour, then he got all excited, and as a kind of Dr. Folamour in a horror picture, he went on sort of in a mad speech, which I amazed.
MacArthur wanted to widen the war to China with atomic bombs in order to win the war in Korea. These were not the policies in Washington.
Well, Washington did not want a general war with China. It would have been a very costly war. We would have had to remobilize our forces so soon after World War II, which would have presented very great political difficulties. And so there was no taste for a larger war against China. The bombing of China to have any effect at all would have had to been general devastation through nuclear weapons, and President Truman was not prepared to do that.
But was Truman prepared to use the bomb, not like MacArthur, to win the war, but to prevent the UN's defeat? Recently declassified documents suggest to some scholars that in the spring of '51 he was.
Truman and Atchison and other advisors were giving very serious consideration to attacking mainland China. Should the Chinese bring in big reinforcements in Korea and maybe threaten to push us off the peninsula? This included taking steps such as issuing an order to hit Chinese cities with atomic bombs and transferring the nuclear cores, which the president had always kept with the Atomic Energy Commission, to military commanders. The reason they were kept, of course, was so the president would have complete control over these things. Sand pits for the bombs on Okinawa, Guam were refurbished. Much of this was done so that the Chinese could see it, I think. But the idea that MacArthur was the only person who thought of extending the war to the mainland is false.
Shortly after the UN retook Seoul, MacArthur was informed that Truman was planning a secret initiative to start truce talks with the Chinese. He saw such a move as defeated and countered with his own public peace offer, which was tantamount to a demand for unconditional communist surrender. For the president, it was the last straw. From then on, Truman was looking for an excuse to remove the troublesome general. He soon found one. A letter MacArthur had written to Republican leader Joseph Martin, criticizing administration policy.
I've thought long and hard about this question of extending the war in Asia. I've discussed it many times with the ablest military advisors in the country. I believe with all my heart that the course we are following is the best course. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
The storm which has been brewing between Washington and General MacArthur finally breaks with the news that the Supreme Commander has been dismissed by President Truman. Members of the press leave the conference in Washington to release the world-shaking story which will affect international policy in every capital.
I sat with President Truman on a number of meetings in which this matter was discussed. His attitude was that there are 1 million Americans who can be president as well as I can be. But damn it all, I'm president. And I'm not going to turn this office over to my successor with its prerogatives impaired by an American general. In my own mind, I have no doubt that that was the central idea in Truman's mind when he relieved General MacArthur.
Secretary of the Army Frank Pace was in Korea, and he informed General Ridgway that he was now in command. Then they went to Tokyo. Pace was burdened with the duty of delivering the news to MacArthur. He was spared. MacArthur had heard it on the radio.
And an apocryphal story grew up in the Pacific that the AP had said, "What would you have done?" To which I replied, "No problem." Presidential order, I'd commandeered the first plane. I'd have flown directly to Tokyo. After hours, I knew General MacArthur in his quarters. I'd have commandeered the first vehicle. I would have driven there immediately. I would have rushed to his quarters, rung the bell, shoved the orders under the door, and run like hell.
Truman's action was deeply unpopular in America. MacArthur returned home for the first time in 13 years to a delirious reception.
It's hard to remember what a giant figure MacArthur was in his relief. Hard to remember the almost passionate heroism, or contrary-wise, the degree to which Mr. Truman was treated as inadequate, inappropriate, wrong, a dwarf, burned in effigy. And yet, it's one of the great fascinations of history that has come to be regarded as one of the outstanding achievements of his entire administration. you'd have to have lived in that time, particularly I, who had participated in this process, to understand the enormous violence of feeling that was involved as this great hero was released.
Paradoxically, the sacking was MacArthur's finest hour. He had long considered himself a potential Republican presidential candidate. Now, for a moment, the ambition seemed achievable.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point. The hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Like the old soldier of that battle. I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
As the quip went, there wasn't a dry eye on the Republican side or a dry seat on the Democrats. MacArthur's political hopes came to nothing, but his Korean allies truly missed him.
그 사람의 퇴직은 국민으로서뿐만 아니라
Both as a Korean and a soldier, I deeply regretted the sacking of General MacArthur, for an important opportunity for unification of Korea was lost.
The new field commander in Korea was General James Van Fleet. Ridgway rose to take MacArthur's place in Japan. Van Fleet was a battle-hardened fighter, not known to pull his punches.
I knew I had a good command under good leaders and enough power, both artillery and air, and it was flexible. I could move it about to hit the concentrations of the enemy as they provided the targets.
General Van Fleet was a big man, genial man, very bluff, big hand. And I guess he was one of those Army men who just likes to fight. I remember his public relations officer telling me one day, he said his public relations officer was a rather mild-mannered man, and he came back, he said, I went over to see the general this morning, and he looked out the window. I said, boy, what a beautiful day out there. What a great day for fighting.
The Chinese were preparing an all-out spring offensive. It began on the 22nd of April, 1951. Over the following days, the UN line in the west was pushed back as much as 50 miles, and Seoul was threatened yet again. Van Fleet decided to stand firm and hold the capital.
Now, when I had made that decision, Ridgway came over from Tokyo to say, Van, you've got to get across the river. The people in Washington are worried that you'll be destroyed, and they've asked me to come over and talk it over with you. I said, Matt, this is the finest battlefield you can fight on. You can't find a better one. I'm prepared to, and I'm confident I can hold.
It was one of the heaviest battles of the war. The Chinese and North Koreans threw some 500,000 men against well-defended positions. Overwhelmed by sheer numbers, UN troops were forced to make a series of prepared retreats.
The Chinese army at this stage imagined that they had nothing between them and Seoul and a clear run in that direction. But at Kapyong, they met the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment astride the road.
They had to clear this battalion out of the road because they needed the road as a supply line to maintain a force further. And so they turned round and attacked the battalion. They attacked it all that night and all the next day, and the battalion didn't give ground. The ground wasn't important, but what was important was the fact that they bought 24 hours in which the United Nations Command had time to reposition a force in the path of the Chinese and Seoul didn't fall.
It was a close call. The communists reached the suburbs of the city, but suffered enormous casualties under the onslaught of UN artillery and airstrikes. North of Seoul, on the Imjin River, the British 29th Brigade, which included the Northumberland Fusiliers, the Royal Ulster Rifles, and the Gloucestershire Regiment, were paying the price of defending the capital. Ordered to hold their ground, the Gloucesters became isolated. After 3 days, they still faced wave upon wave of attacking Chinese infantry.
That morning, the company that I was commanding, we had 2 major attacks. Repelled partly by ourselves, by police counterattack, but thanks mainly to the air weapons used by our own people against the enemy advancing and by our guns. But one dreadful thing happened in that the gun line itself was in danger of being captured, and it then had to withdraw, and they warned us that they could only give us another hour of close artillery support.
On the 3rd day of the battle, the enemy battalion retreated to a hill. Our translators intercepted a message on the radio. We couldn't tell if the accent was American or British, but the message told the enemy to retreat before 12 noon. After that, the artillery would cease, and they would have no cover.
A number of soldiers misguided me, believing that I was going to lead them out and attach themselves to me. And as we reached the southern end of the valley, began to get close to ascending over the ridge of the forest, the Chinese on the hilltops all around began firing. Not into us, but closer and closer, firing in naval parlance, shots across our bows. And it came closer, and came to the point where we were either going to stop or they were going to start hitting us. So I said to the soldiers with me, smash your weapons. And then the moment of great shame. I was tired after the long day of the battle, and not a great deal of sleep, and I felt very ashamed that it ended in this way, but I thought it was the only thing we could do.
When the prisoners came down from the hill, we gathered them together and asked them to sit on the ground. They seemed to lack a sense of reality. They'd not eaten for several days and wanted to go back to their trucks to get food. Of course, we did not allow them to go, and told them the trucks now belonged to the Chinese people. So we asked them to sit down, and in a couple of hours they were taken to the rear.
The Gloucester's 1st Battalion was effectively wiped out as a combat unit. Only 63 men made it back to regroup behind the UN line. More than 200 were wounded or killed, and 600 taken prisoner by the Chinese. Among them was Sam Davies, chaplain to the Gloucesters, who volunteered to remain with the wounded men.
We were all lined up, and some, I suppose, fairly high-ranking Chinese officer or commissar in perfectly understandable English addressed us, telling us that we were now in the hands of the Chinese people's volunteers, that we were shortly to learn the truth about the great conflict in which we were engaged. We were to be given the chance to learn and study, and that we would eventually be able to ally ourselves to the peace-loving peoples of the world in their great battle against American capitalism. So that was the very first time that we knew we were in not just for an ordinary sort of imprisonment, but for a sort of, I suppose you'd describe it, a George Orwellian type of imprisonment with indoctrination.
As UN soldiers headed north to experience one harsh regime of imprisonment, communist POWs in the south marched to another controversial and bitter captivity. The military situation was approaching a stalemate, and the battle on both sides became one for men's minds. It was on the outcome of this struggle that the future course of the Korean War would depend.
This program was made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. For a printed transcript, send $5 to Journal Graphics, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. To order by credit card, call 212-227-READ. Please specify Korea, an entirely new war, and today's date.
This is PBS.